For those of you that don't know me, my name's Rick Gatewood, president of the society. Wawenoc Genealogical Society. There you go. We're very fortunate to have world famous Dana Murch speaking today. And without further ado.
So, can everybody hear me? Not that well. You're in the front row, for crying out loud. Oh, we have a volume switch. Okay. Ooh, much, much better. So, as many of you know, I am diligently working on the history and genealogy of the entire Murch family of Maine, which I never should have started. The 5th generation is just finished. 491 pages, all typeset, 6x9. I may never finish this. But in the meantime, I discovered that the Murch family went back 200 years in Belfast, and I had no idea. It's always the case in genealogy. So I have many stories to tell about these people. Stories about the Mayflower, the War of 1812, block making, lawyers, judges, and postmasters, Gettysburg, poetry, ice making, weather reports, hydroelectric generation, and, not to be ignored, the Pygmy Circus, which is the treat. So I hope you will agree at the end of this talk that these were ordinary people who did lead extraordinary lives and had extraordinary connections throughout Maine and New England, which is always fun for me as a genealogist. So this is a timeline of some of the Murches, not all, who lived in Belfast. You don't need to know their names because I'll introduce you to all of them. The earliest was Zebulon, who was here in 1814. The last is me. I came here with my wife in 1999. 200 years, with the sole exception of the 19 years between the death of my great aunt and when Meredith and I came here. So pretty close to 200 years. And I want to dedicate this to my friend, Francis Marsano, who died several years ago, who loved Belfast and would have loved this. He just never got to hear it. So, here's a family tree that shows the Murches I'm going to talk about. And I'll go through briefly to get to the people that we care about. At the top, Walter Murch and his wife, Deborah, were immigrants probably from Devonshire on the south coast of England, came to York in 1714. He was a cod fisherman. His son was William, married Tabitha Young of York. She was a descendant of a long line of cod fishermen from Kittery, one of whom owned land on Spunny Nose Island in the Isles of Shoals, where they not only caught cod, they made their own salt. And it was so good, they set the market price for cod in Europe and lived there. And if you've ever been there, there's not much more than rock. Third generation, up here, Walter Murch. He was a native of Biddeford, moved to Gorham, and married Jerusha Brown, who came from Eastham on Cape Cod and was a Mayflower descendant. They had 3 sons, Zebulon, Simeon, and Ephraim, all of whom were the progenitors of the Murch families who came to Belfast. So, to start this, I should have had these bold, but to start with Zebulon. Zebulon was born at Gorham in 1771. In 1794, he married a Buxton native, Molly Pennell. Molly was a 4th-generation descendant of Thomas Pennell, a weaver from the Isle of Jersey in the Channel Islands, who immigrated to Gloucester, Mass. in 1709. The Pennell family can trace its roots back to the Middle Ages when Raoul Pennell was a companion of William of Normandy, aka William the Conqueror, who conquered England in 1066. Immigrant Thomas Pennell married a Gloucester girl whose father had received a grant of land at Narragansett No. 1, which we know today as Buxton, Maine. Zebulon was a member of the Gorham Town Militia in 1795. Zebulon and Molly had 3 children born at Gorham before Molly's early death shortly after 1802. Now, Zebulon doesn't appear in any census by name prior to 1820. And as I said to you, I know he was in Belfast in 1814. How do I know that? Well, little Belfast history. Belfast was first settled in 1769 by a group of Scots-Irish proprietors from Londonderry, New Hampshire. The plan that you see on the map on the screen is of the lots that were drawn up the year before the town was settled. The settlement was incorporated as Belfast in 1773, then largely abandoned during the Revolutionary War. The town was resettled after the war, and by 1783, it had 245 inhabitants. By 1800, the population had doubled to almost 700. This is an 1805 map of the village of Belfast from Williamson's history. By 1710, the population had doubled yet again to almost 1,300 inhabitants. Then came the War of 1812, in which Great Britain sought to avenge the Revolutionary War and regain control of its lost American colonies, and in which a British embargo crippled the economy of coastal towns of New England, which is why they hated the war. This is Osgood Carleton's 1795 map of the District of Maine. The treaty that ended the Revolutionary War did not set the boundary of eastern or northern Maine. The British thought it was the Penobscot. The Americans said the St. John. So it was a big swath of land in the middle that was in dispute. The British saw the new war of 1812 as a way to further their claim to down east Maine, all the way to the Penobscot. And so, on September 1st, 1814, the British occupied Castine without resistance. The following day, a British force of some 500 to 600 men landed at Belfast and occupied the town, again without resistance. The local militia was immediately mustered, and the militia shadowed the British troops, who then marched to Hampden, routed the local militia there, told everybody they were going to burn their houses. They didn't, thankfully. The British then returned to Belfast with the Belfast militia trailing behind. And British evacuated Belfast on the 6th of September, so it was 5 days total. The Belfast militia then entered the town and remained on duty in the event of further British aggression until the end of September, when they were dismissed. And in Williamson's history, there is a payroll for the company of Captain Nathaniel Swan. There is Zebulon, who served for 19 days and received $6.98 for his service. So I know he was here by 1814, and in all likelihood, a few years before that, but I can't prove any of it. So next up is William, who is Zebulon's son. I only know 2 things about William. In the Belfast marriages, William Murch of Belfast married Esther Smith of Northport. Gives their intentions and marriage certificate all in 1826. Based on this record, he was probably born no later than 1806 to be 20 years old. Esther was also born in 1806. 6 months after William and Esther got married, their widowed parents married. So I suspect they introduced each other. It's sort of cool. The second thing I know about William is from the probate records for his sons. This is from the Waldo County probate. It's a bond given by Nathaniel Lowney and others. And it states, Nathaniel Lowney is appointed guardian of William H. Murch and Benjamin F. Murch of Belmont in said county, Waldo, minors above the age of 14 years, sons of William Murch, late of said Belfast, drowned. Dated 1850. So that's the only other thing I know about him, is that he drowned in 1850. Probably a fisherman, but I can't prove it. I know a little bit more about his two sons. William, whose full name was William Henry Murch, became a farmer and was living with a cousin in Belmont in the 1900 census, and he died unmarried sometime after that census. Son Benjamin, whose full name was Benjamin Franklin Murch, I love how they use these names, moved to Massachusetts, where he was a ship caulker, married twice, and had a son who left no descendants. So this entire line that I've been tracing ends. Next up is James Bowden Murch. He was born Bowden Murch in Unity in 1808, the last of 8 children of Simeon Murch and Rachel Payne. In 1794, Bowden's parents, Simeon and Rachel, had famously tracked 100 miles through the wilderness from Gorham to Unity to start a new farm as squatters, all on land that was owned by James Bowden Jr., son of a wealthy Boston merchant and Massachusetts governor. James Bowden Jr. used his inheritance to endow Bowden College, which was named after his father. Bowden Murch's mother, Rachel Payne, was a descendant of 4 Mayflower passengers, and is the second cousin, once removed, of Robert Treat Payne, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Bowden studied law at the office of the Honorable Samuel Benson in Winthrop and was admitted to the Kennebec County Bar in 1835. His employer, Samuel Benson, served in the Maine legislature, U.S. House of Representatives, and as Maine Secretary of State. He was also Secretary of the Androscoggin and Kennebec Railroad, which became, for those of us who know and love Maine, the Maine Central Railroad. In 1835, Bowden had his name legally changed by the Maine legislature, which did all male name changes at the time, to James Bowden Murch, I assume in honor of either James Jr. or James Sr. He married at Winthrop in 1837 Mary Lucretia Hussey. Mary was a descendant of Christopher Hussey, who immigrated to Saugus, Mass., now Lynn, in 1632 on the ship William and Francis. The fact that we know any of these ships always amazes me. Mary Hussey was also a Mayflower descendant. Following their marriage, James and Mary returned to James' hometown of Unity, where James practiced law, served 4 years as Waldo County attorney, and then served 6 years as Unity postmaster. Waldo County was created in 1827, so James was one of the early county attorneys, if not the first. And while postmasters were politically appointed, being a postmaster in the early 19th century was a position of trust that required honesty, punctuality, and organization. So not just everybody got it. James B. Murch, age 41 lawyer, was listed as a head of household at Unity in the 1850 census. And genealogists know that was the first census that named every member of the household. And there is the family. And interesting, his wife Mary was born in North Carolina. Her father was a ship captain, and she was born on a trip that he had made to North Carolina. James Bowden Murch then moved his family to Belfast. You knew we'd get to Belfast eventually. In 1858. This is the Belfast city map for the following year, 1859. By 1860, just before the start of the Civil War, the population of Belfast had grown to 5,520 people. It then declined, as did the population in most towns in coastal Maine, following the Civil War, and did not reach its 1850 population again until 1940. I'll repeat that. 1860 to 1940, the population of Belfast had dropped. That's 80 years, which tells you a lot about what happened in coastal Maine. This is the Belfast village map of 1659. And then here's a blow-up that shows the house that James Bowden purchased on Congress Street. That is the house today, owned by my friends Dave and Judy Bond. Yep. In 1860, James Bowden Murch was elected city supervisor, sort of city manager. And then he was appointed later judge of the Belfast Police Court. Died in Belfast in 1880 at the age of 71 from consumption, which we know as tuberculosis. According to Williamson's History of Belfast, Judge Murch was, quote, a sound lawyer, a broad mind and large heart, cheerful, and having a keen sense of humor, unquote. Now, it should be noted that the author, Joseph Williamson, was also an attorney, also became a judge, and clearly knew Judge Murch, so had an opinion. James' wife, Mary, died in 1896 of pneumonia, and they are buried together at Grove Cemetery. Next up are the two children of James and Mary, Charlotte Louise and Lucius Holcomb. I'll start with Charlotte. And for those of you who love naming conventions, Charlotte is named after her maternal great-grandmother, Charlotte Bartlett. Charlotte was born at Unity in 1841 and moved with her parents, as you've heard, to Belfast in 1858. In 1868, she married Frank W. Patterson of Belfast. Frank was a descendant of Robert Patterson, who was born in Antrim, now in Northern Ireland, and was part of the Ulster Scots migration to Maine in the 1720s. He settled in Saco, but it was his grandson, Nathaniel Patterson, who was one of the first settlers in Belfast in 1770. He resided on Lot 32 on the east side, and that's highlighted in blue. It's right near the mouth of the Goose River.
Not Patterson Hill?
No, I don't know who Patterson Hill is named for. Ah. In the 1870 census, Charlotte and Frank were living in Belfast in the home of Frank's parents. Frank was employed as a post office clerk. Charlotte and Frank had a daughter, Katie, born in 1871. Then the bottom fell out of the relationship between Charlotte and Frank. Oh, there's daughter Katie. The Maine Supreme Judicial Court, which handled all divorces at the time, heard Charlotte's case. She sued for divorce in September of 1878. She stated that her husband refuses to provide for her a suitable home or support in any way, that their tempers are incompatible, that he has often cruelly treated and abused her, and has brutally beaten her and choked her, so that the marks of his hands were visible on her throat and neck for several days. And at one time threatened to throw her out of the window, and has repeatedly told her to leave the house and go off and take care of herself. The Supreme Court, after hearing from the parties, and with the consent of the parties, granted the divorce and gave custody of now 8-year-old daughter Katie to Frank, with Charlotte having the right to see her daughter at suitable times and places. This was, what happened at the time. Women were not seen as having a viable means of support for a child, so very few of them had paying jobs. The arrangement with Katie didn't last long. 4 months later, Charlotte petitioned the court to give her full custody of her daughter, stating that soon after her divorce, she called at the house where daughter Katie was kept, and that the woman in whose charge Katie was left drove Charlotte from the house with clenched fists and abusive language, violently shut and locked the door in her face, and ordered her to keep away from the house. And since that time, she, Charlotte, has not been allowed to see daughter Katie, and has repeatedly sent Katie presents of useful articles of clothing which have been returned with insulting notes improperly addressed. After hearing from both parties, the Maine Supreme Court decreed that Charlotte was to have general care and custody of daughter Katie, commencing 1st of June, 1879, with Frank to have Katie with him for the month of August each year till she turned 18. On the 16th of October, 1879, 6 months after winning custody of daughter Katie, Charlotte Louise Murch Patterson married as her second husband Bangor lawyer Bertram Lewis Smith. Bertram was a descendant of a shoemaker from County Somerset in England, who came to Maine by way of Montreal, then settled in Albion. With his son, who was Bertram's father, moved to Exeter, a little town north of Bangor, in 1855, where he had a successful farming and orchard operation.
Was he the one that kept taking her back, helping her go back to court?
I have no idea. Yeah. Probably. This is the marriage record for Bertram, and so Bertram resided in Bangor, lawyer, born in Exeter. Charlotte Patterson, maiden name Murch, so I know I've got the right person. Age 23, age 24. Well, there's a couple of curious things about this. First of all, Charlotte's not 24. She's 38. 15 years older than her freshly minted lawyer husband. In all subsequent public records, Charlotte consistently understates her age by as much as 14 years. The second curious thing is where the marriage took place. Malden, Massachusetts. There is no record that either Bertram or Charlotte filed intentions to marry in either of the towns that they lived in. I think they eloped. I mean, a 23-year-old young lawyer marrying a 38 divorcee with an 18-year-old daughter, with an 8-year-old daughter, rather. That's unusual now, let alone then. So I think they eloped.
Why did you mean age 24 on this document?
She lied. She lied.
Women have been doing that for ages.
The for the record, you can go look for census records, and women often understate their age. Sometimes not by much, but very often. Yeah. Right. Charlotte then appears in the household of her husband Bertram in the 1880 census for Bangor, where he was working as a lawyer. Daughter Katie appears with the surname Smith. She was born Patterson. It's always Smith from then on, and she was either legally adopted or functionally adopted. by Bertram. Charlotte and Bertram had a son, Bertram Jr., born at Bangor shortly after the 1880 census. Charlotte and Bertram then moved to Patton, a little town on the back road going north in Aroostook County. Bertram practiced law there and later served as a Penobscot County attorney and later as a county judge. At this point, except for census records and a death record, this would be the last we would expect to hear from Charlotte. But she has one more surprise. She became a published journalist and poet. A biography of Charlotte, written by the Reverend James Thompson Bixby, who was a Unitarian minister in Belfast in the 1870s, was published in 1892 in the Magazine of Poetry and Literary Review. Charlotte Louise Smith was born in Unity, a quiet town in the eastern part of Maine. Her father, James Bowden Murch, was a lawyer and a gentleman of scholarly taste who placed a volume of Shakespeare in his daughter's hands at the age when most children are reading nursery tales. Before she was 15 years of age, 2 of her poems were published in the Boston Traveler, and since that time she has been a contributor to nearly all of the important newspapers in Maine and also to many influential journals in other parts of the United States. It'd be nice to know what the journals were, because going through journals looking for her is next to impossible. The wild and romantic scenery of northern Maine has had an especial charm for Mrs. Smith, and the picturesque life and landscapes which the lakes and forests of the Aroostook region supply have formed the subject of Mrs. Smith's best work. According to her 1918 obituary, published in the Republican Journal, quote, Mrs. Smith was of high culture and marked literary talent, aside from her beautiful womanly characteristics which made her beloved by all who knew her, unquote. As a good Mainer would say, Charlotte was wicked smart. And based on, I think this is a woodcut from a photograph, and the description of her, I suspect, as a good Mainer would say, she was drop dead gorgeous.
So what happened to poor Mr. Patterson?
Later. Examples of her poetry were published in the Magazine of Poetry in 1892, one called Melanocket, which is a misspelling of Millinocket Lake, where wild Aroostook clasps in fear her virgin daughters to her breast, and hears the fatal axe each year ring closer to her greenest nest. Caught in the lace of sedge and brake shines pearl-like Millinocket Lake. Millinocket means land of many islands. If you've ever been there, that is exactly what it is. But sadly, Charlotte knew more family tragedy in her life, as both of her children predeceased her. Son Bertram graduated from Bowdoin College in June of 1903. In September of that year, he died of appendicitis at Lewiston while visiting friends on his way to enter Harvard Law School. Daughter Katie married, but then divorced within a few years. In the 1900 census, she was living with her parents in Patton and teaching elocution at Patton Academy, which is the local high school. She died in 1912 at the age of 40 from melancholia with exhaustion, what the death record says, which sounds like clinical depression. And so this line of the Murch family died out with Charlotte's death in 1917. Next up is Charlotte's brother, Lucius Holcomb Murch. Another one of these people, I have no idea where these names came from. Lucius was born at Unity in 1839, graduated from Hamden Academy, returned to Unity to serve as postmaster, and then moved with his parents, as we've heard, to Belfast in 1858. In Belfast, this guy became a one-person juggernaut. He first served as assistant postmaster and then as express messenger on the steamboat line between Portland and Bangor. And then worked as an editor of the Republican Journal before starting a short-lived mail-order business in books, pictures, and novelties, operating under the name of the Union Book Company. After closing that business, he was for a time an editor and manager at the Progressive Age and the Belfast Advertiser, both short-lived local newspapers. Also found time to serve on the City Board of Assessors, trustee of the library, Waldo County historian, and chief Templar of the Belfast Lodge of the Independent Order of Good Templars. He was a staunch Democrat and active in state and local politics. But in addition, he has two special claims to fame. He was elected city clerk in 1877, served for a year, re-elected in 1886, and every year thereafter, until his death in 1903. In 1901, the Boston Sunday Globe ran a feature story about Lucius, with the claim that his 16 years in office is without a doubt the longest term of office in that capacity of any city or town in Maine, and possibly New England. Lucius also recorded the weather, as reported by Williamson in his History of Belfast and by the Republican Journal in his obituary. Lucius began when a boy, keeping a record of the weather, and made and recorded his observations of the temperature and state of the weather 3 times a day, together with the nature and duration of storms, for more than 42 years. You think I have dedication? In 1885, he became the official reporter of weather for the New England Meteorological Society. And in 1892, was appointed official weather observer for Belfast by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Lucius inherited the home that you've seen, the brick house on Congress Street, lived there until his death, never married, died at home in 1903 at the age of 64. Because he never married or had heirs, no one's told his story. So I'm here to tell his story.
That's the same guy with the white mustache?
Yep.
He looks older than 64.
Well, people aged quickly.
He's right about his age, too.
Following his death, the Belfast City Council adopted a resolution of respect for the memory of City Clerk Lucius Murch, stating that, in his death, we have lost a man of sterling ability, one truly fit for the position which he held for many years. Carefulness of his work in all its details characterized the man. Now we finally get to my line. 3rd great-grandparents, Lewis Cobb Murch and Lois Coombs. Lewis was born in Hamden in 1801, the second of 11 children of Ephraim Murch and Rebecca Cobb. Ephraim had moved to Hamden from Gorham, where he married Rebecca Cobb. And she is one of my mysteries. I have no clue where she's born, who her parents were, how old she was, nothing. And there are way too many Cobbs to figure out. In 1804, Lewis moved with his parents and their growing family to Castine. Lewis was a 13-year-old boy when the British invaded and occupied Castine during, as we've heard, the War of 1812. Lewis's story of his involvement was related in his obituary in the Republican Journal. Mr. Lewis C. Murch of this city died at his home on Thursday last, aged nearly 86. He was a boy in Castine when on the 1st of September 1814, General Goslin, in command of the British forces, took the town. The American garrison fired one shot, blew up the fort, and got the hell out of there. When General Goslin landed, he could see none of the American troops. It was the boast of Mr. Murch that he was the first person that General Goslin addressed when he landed. Several boys had gathered around when the forces landed, and the general, addressing the boy Murch, said, "Boy, Where are the troops? In his old age, Mr. Murch was fond of telling, and probably retelling, the incident many times at the office of the Republican Journal. I can't do anything like that because the Republican Journal doesn't exist anymore. In 1818, Ephraim Cobb signed an indenture apprenticing his 17-year-old son, Lewis, to a local tradesperson to learn the art of being a pump and block maker. And for reasons that I will never understand, but for which I'm always grateful, one of his descendants gave a copy of that indenture to the Maine Historical Society in Portland, and there it is. That's the only reason I know that Lewis's father was a common laborer. That's how he's listed here. So there's a bunch of boilerplate here. The apprentice is to serve and obey his master, show up for work, not play cards or dice, and not contract for marriage. You're here to work. For his part, the indenture says the master was to instruct Lewis in the art of pump and block making, to provide Lewis with good and sufficient meat, drink, clothing, and lodging during the term of his apprenticeship, was to ensure that Lewis was taught to read, write, and cipher, that is, do mathematics, and at the end of his indenture, the master was to provide Lewis with 2 suits of wearing apparel, one suitable for the Lord's Day and one for working days. And as many of you know, blocks were wooden pulleys that are part of the rigging of sailing ships. Pumps were metal and wood devices used to remove bilge water. And of course, Belfast was a booming shipbuilding town at this time, so his services were in demand. Lewis completed his indenture in 1822 on his 21st birthday. Whoop. He then married Lois Coombs of Islesboro in 1825. Lois is a descendant of Anthony Coombs, a blacksmith who was in Wells by 1687. And as some of you have heard my story before, a recent DNA study has proven that Anthony Coombs was born Antoine Comu, the son of early Acadian settlers, Pierre Comu and Rose Bayon, and came from Acadia. Come on. Whoop. Lewis and Lois had a child born at Castine before moving to Belfast sometime between 1826 and 1830. Lewis then operated a pump and block making business in Belfast for over 60 years. There's the family in the 1850 census. All 4 sons would spend some of their lives in the pump and block making business. Sons Henry and Isaac moved to Ellsworth, where they had a business there. And everything was fine with the family until the Great Belfast Fire, October the 12th, 1865, as reported in Williamson's History of Belfast. At about 10:30 in the evening, a boat shop situated on the Old Common was discovered to be on fire. The weather was clear, with a moderate breeze blowing from the north. Before a general alarm could be given, the building was enveloped in flames, which speedily extended to storehouses in the rear containing hay, and to those on Kimball Wharf. The tide was low, and the reservoirs were dry. To these disadvantages was added the inefficiency of our fire apparatus. The conflagration reached its height at about midnight. Main Street then presented a sight which will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. The wind had changed to north by east, sweeping directly up from the water, and the flames which emerged from the burning buildings on each side formed a magnificent arch of fire. At 7 in the morning, after raging for nearly 9 hours, disaster was stayed, and never did daylight dawn upon a more exhausted community. 125 buildings, embraced within an area of about 20 acres, were consumed. Most of them were old and of wood, and one of them was the dwelling and pump and block shop of Lewis Murch. This is from Williamson's History of Belfast. The red line outlines the burned district. And that's where Lewis's block shop was on Lower Spring Street. Well, it's 1865. Lewis and his family needed a new place to live. So they purchased a lot on Charles Street from Axel Hayford. Some of you may know the name Hayford, builder of the Hayford Block. He was mayor of Belfast and president of the Belfast and Moosehead Railroad. He built the Hayford Block shortly after the big fire of 1865. We'll hear more about Axel later, so keep him in mind. This is an 1875 map of Belfast showing the location of the home of Lewis Murch. This is a old, what do you call it, stereoscope photograph, two of them that you look at together. Probably about 1885, based on the people who were in it, at their home. And Lewis and Lois are the two people sitting. That's this approximate view of the house today on Charles Street, currently owned by Cher Jones and Therese Bagnardi. Lewis Cobb died in 1887 at the age of 86. According to his obituary, he was a quiet, unassuming man and was well-liked in the community. His wife Lois died in 1888 at the age of 82. That is their gravestone, which I had professionally cleaned a few years ago. It's in the old part of the cemetery under all the trees, and I mean those stones really get covered with lichens and moss. Next up is my second great-grandfather. There, Charles Augustus Murch. Both Charles and Augustus are Murch family names. Charles was born in Belfast in 1842, the sixth of 7 children of Lewis and Lois. By 1860, he was working as a blockmaker in his father's shop and was married to 17-year-old Waldoboro native Francis Benner. Francis was the descendant of a number of early Scots-Irish and German settlers of Warren and Waldoboro, who came to Maine in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s. And upstairs is a book called The Broad Bay Pioneers. I think that's the right name. Of all the earlier settlers of Waldoboro. I can trace her German line back to the immigrants and what ship they came on, what year they came, which is great. In 1862, 2 years after his marriage, 20-year-old Charles Augustus Murch enlisted in the newly formed 19th Maine Infantry and went off to fight in the Civil War. The 19th Maine mustered at Bath in 1862, moved by ship to Washington, D.C., where it was assigned to guard duty, then traveled by rail to Virginia to join the Union Army of the Potomac, and participated in the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. 1863, participated in battles at Chancellorsville, Mary's Height, and Salem Church, all in Northern Virginia. The regiment then marched north through Thoroughfare Gap and arrived at Gettysburg near midnight on July the 1st, 1863, where advance units of the Union and Confederate armies had skirmished that day. The regiment had covered 160 miles in 2 weeks. That was, of course, the beginning of the Battle of Gettysburg. The following day, the 19th Regiment was involved in heavy fighting on the left of the Union line. Sometime during that fighting, Charles Augustus Murch was wounded by a rifle ball that passed through his left leg just above the knee. He received a medical discharge and subsequently an invalid pension. That is his discharge paper, and I have the original. Charles came home after his discharge, and he and Frances had one child, a son, Melvin, born in 1866. And sometime about 1870, they sat for photographs. I'm told there's a resemblance. Yeah? The 19th Maine Regiment held a reunion in Belfast in 1875. Charles is somewhere in this photograph taken in front of the post office building. In 1876, Charles bought a parcel in Lot 28 on the east side, where the Goose River actually runs through the middle of the lot. And that was their home. This is a photograph of that taken sometime between 1876 and his death in 1884. The best of my knowledge, the house no longer exists. Can't find any evidence of it. By 1874, Charles had served a term as city alderman, was a member of the local post of the Grand Army of the Republic, was a prominent member of the Oddfellows, and was a foreman at Hiram Pierce's ice harvesting company operating on the Goose River. Then tragedy struck, as told by a co-worker. On the 8th of January, we began to cut and store ice for the season. There was several inches of loose snow at the ice houses. About 8 o'clock, Murch and I were passing from the ice houses toward the elevator near the slide, which was about 10 feet off the ground, down which ice was being sluiced, when a block of ice had stopped in the slide near where we stood, and then another block of ice came from the elevator and struck the ice in the slide with such force that a piece weighing about 10 pounds was broken off and flew where we stood. When Murch saw the danger, he exclaimed, "Look out for the ice," at the same time endeavoring to get out of the way by grasping his lame leg in his hands, as he had not the strength in his leg to raise it out of the snow. But the slight delay cost him his life, as the ice struck him on the head, from which injury he died 12 hours later, after getting shot through the kneecap at Gettysburg. His wife, Frances, was later able to obtain a widow's pension by successfully arguing to the government that his death was due in part to his war wound. And that is her pension record, which I also have the original of. After the death of her husband, Frances Murch and a young son moved to a house on Bridge Street, now Anderson Street, a little street between Main Street and Waldo Avenue, and worked as a domestic nurse. That's a picture of the house probably taken in the 1920s. Whoop. Whoop. That's the house today on the lower right. I don't actually know who lives there, but this house was in the Murch family for just shy of 100 years. So in 1885, we have Louis and Lois and their family living on Charles Street. Lucius living on Congress Street in the home he inherited from his father. And the widow Frances Benner Murch living on Bridge Street. So they're all pretty close to each other. Frances Murch became very active in her community. She was Grand Noble of the local lodge of the Rebeccas, which was the women's auxiliary of the Oddfellows. Member of the Belfast chapter of the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. Also a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WTCU advocated for prohibition, women's suffrage, legal protections for women and children, equal pay for equal work, improved food safety, and prison reform. This is in the early 20th century. Today, the WTCU has chapters in 36 countries and remains one of the oldest continuously operating women's organizations in the world. Frances was also an active member of the Belfast Universalist Church and was a member of the board of directors of the Association of the Belfast Home for Aged Women, now the Deborah Lincoln House. Her own Debbie Bird was on the board of. She was in fact nominated for membership by Deborah Lincoln herself. She died in 1923, at the age of 80. She lived just long enough to get the right to vote. Frances is buried with her husband Charles in Grove Cemetery. And there's the three interlocked chain. That's the symbol of the International Order of the Oddfellows. My grandfather, Melvin Charles Murch. Great-grandfather, I should say, great-grandfather. Melvin was born at Belfast in 1866, the only child of Charles and Frances Benner Murch. 17 years old when his father died in 1884. 1887, he married 18-year-old Caroline Ella Simmons. Caroline was a native of North Union, a descendant of Moses Simmons, born Moises Simonson, a native of Leiden, Holland, who arrived at Plymouth Colony a year after the Mayflower. She's a descendant of 9 passengers on the Mayflower, including John Alden, Priscilla Mullins, and Miles Standish, who were made famous by fellow descendant and Maine native Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish. Melvin appears to have tried his hand at a series of occupations. In 1890, he was an employee of the Belfast Gas and Electric Company, founded by Hiram Pierce. 1894, he was listed in the Belfast City Directory as a commercial salesman. 1895, he was a streetcar conductor in Boston. However do I know that? Well, I have his conductor's license. It's amazing what things get saved. Melvin was soon back in Belfast, where he and Carolyn had 2 children, born by 1900. Those are the 2 children. You'll meet them later. He then worked for at least 10 years in a local shoe shop as a laster. A laster was someone who attached the upper part of the shoe to the sole. Then he found his true calling. From 1910 until his death in 1928, Melvin worked as the station operator at the hydroelectric plant located at the mouth of the Goose River. Oh. These are photographs I have from the generating station, all dated 1911, which is all terribly ironic since I spent my professional career regulating hydropower projects for the state of Maine. It's in my blood, yeah. And there is Melvin standing at the door to the powerhouse. Again, 1911. Except for their time in Boston, Melvin and Carolyn spent their lives in Melvin's mother's home on Bridge Street. Melvin was active in the Oddfellows and was a regular at the Universalist Church. And for years, Melvin was marshal of the Belfast Band and was a general favorite in calling the dances at balls, having a strong and clear voice. Melvin died in 1928 from liver and colon cancer at the age of 61. His wife, Carolyn Ella Simmons Murch, died in 1957 from heart and kidney disease. She was 87. She lived long enough to see 4 generations of the Murch family. Whoop, 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 whoop. I need to remember to forward. So there's Caroline. Her son, my grandfather, Arthur. My father, Randall. And the twins, Dana and Peggy. Now we come to my grandfather, Arthur Rodney Murch. I have no idea where the name Arthur came from, no idea where the name Rodney came from. Arthur was born at Belfast in 1888. One of 17 graduating students in the Belfast High School class of 1906. While in high school, he was on the staff of The Mercury, a periodical published by high school students beginning in March of 1903. And there is a photograph of the staff. That's my grandfather. According to the Republican Journal, in outward appearance, The Mercury is second to none of its contemporaries, and in contents, it is fully up to the best. Subscription cost was 50 cents for 5 issues a year. After graduating from high school, Arthur went to work at the Leonard and Barrows shoe shop on Lower Main Street. 1910, he married Elizabeth Aronson. Elizabeth was born in Sister Bay, Wisconsin, the daughter of Swedish immigrants who came there in 1882. After completing the 8th grade, Elizabeth Murch moved to Chicago for work. There she became the governess for a young daughter of Henry and Charlotte Hilton. Turns out that Charlotte Hilton was a native of Belfast, born Charlotte Thorndike Silby, and the family summered in the Belfast area, where Elizabeth as the nanny, and eventually she served out her term and decided to stay, went to work in the shoe shop, and met the person who would become my grandfather. And that's their wedding photos. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Elizabeth was a little spit of a thing. In 1904, Arthur bought a lot on Upper Salmon Street, which was then on the outskirts of the village, and had a gambrel-style house built there the following year. That's a photograph my grandfather took on a glass plate of that house, probably dated 1923. And the photograph I have here is of that house under reconstruction. It's now fully reconstructed and owned by Paul and Jan Scheinkopf. And we got a tour recently. Arthur and Elizabeth had 2 sons, Robert and Randall, born in 1920 and 1925. Arthur worked in local shoe shops his entire life. After her sons graduated from high school, Elizabeth worked as a cook at the Pierce Elementary School. I'm told that it is pronounced Pierce. Yeah. Pierce? Pierce. All right. My grandparents were already in their early 60s when I was born, so they were always old people to me. This is how I remember them. These photographs are from 1964. Arthur was an incorrigible pipe smoker, an avid reader, an amateur photographer, a gardener, and a stamp collector. There's something you don't do today. Elizabeth grew more varieties of iris than I knew could possibly exist. And she was a 50-year member of the Aurora Rebecca Lodge of the Oddfellows. Elizabeth died in April of 1966 at the age of 80. Arthur died less than a year later, at the age of 79. They had been married for 56 years. And they're buried together at the Grove Cemetery with Arthur's parents, Melvin and Carolyn. My grandfather's only sibling was Frances Hester Murch. She was born in 1890, never married, lived the entire life, home she was born in on Ridge Street, now Anderson Street. And she spent her working life as a stitcher at the Thompson Manufacturing Company, what was commonly known as the Thompson Pants Factory on Water Street. Frances Hester died in 1980 from a heart attack at the age of 89, and that's when I met Francis Marsano because I needed a lawyer to help me probate her estate. Then we come to my father, Randall Dubé Murch. Randy was born 1925. His place in Belfast history was secured when, during the Great Depression, He and his brother Robert were participants in the Pygmy Circus. The Pygmy Circus was an annual event from 1931 through 1936. The circus was organized and staged by Little People, a group of local children, all younger than 14, who came, and that's why it became known as the Pygmy Circus. Circus featured a street parade and fairgrounds with a circus tent. We know all this because we have archival footage. Find my cursor here. This is from the archives of the Belfast Historical Society. The street parade featured all of the circus performers along with a menagerie of real and imagined animals, some on foot and some in cages, including Isidore the elephant, Rover the lion, Bobby the tiger, Ino the pony, and Barney the horse. There were also snakes, goldfish, snapping turtle, frogs, white mice, rabbits, a kitten with a big pink bow, and a black dog in a cage who was a panther. Here they are marching up Main Street on their way to Post Office Square. I don't know where that other monument was. It might have been one on Lower Main Street somewhere. And this is quite the parade. I mean, this is the middle of the Depression. And there's Post Office Square. From Main Street, the parade proceeded to the fairgrounds at the corner of Salmon and Congress Streets, or behind my grandparents' house, where hundreds of people saw 2 performances a year. At 5 cents and 10 cents a ticket, the circus grossed over $130 3 years running. That's a lot of people. The circus was a big hit and was reviewed in the Republican Journal, the Bangor Daily News, and even featured in the Boston Sunday Post. At the fairgrounds, there was a midway and refreshments and acts, including acrobatics, skits and stunts, clown routines, boxing and wrestling matches, a live flamingo, who we'll see in a minute, and dancing and musical performances. They're all still trooping in here. There we go. It'll come back. There we go. There's the flamingo. I like to say this is back when kids knew how to have fun. As the poster said, everyone got their money's worth. And this is a photo, 1932 or 33. That's my Uncle Bob. That's my father. Oh, okay. My father, Randy, graduated from Crosby High School in the middle of the Second World War, followed his older brother, Robert, into service in the U.S. Navy. They both served in the South Pacific, Robert on an aircraft carrier, Randall on the USS Endymion, a mobile ship repair facility. The Endymion participated in the assault and occupation of the Palau Islands and Okinawa. The ship underwent numerous suicide plane attacks, but reportedly continued her repair duty uninterrupted, for which many commendations were received. Randy was discharged from active duty after 3 years in 1946. That's his discharge paper. He then went to work for New England Telephone Company and was assigned to work in Aroostook County, specifically Limestone. There he met and married Mary Drusilla Thibodeau, known as Drusy, who was working as a switchboard operator for the Fort Kent Telephone Company. Drusy was a native of St. Francis in the St. John Valley to the west of Fort Kent, and was a descendant of many of the early settlers of both Acadia and Quebec City. And they were distant cousins and never knew it. Unfortunately, my father was a lifelong smoker and a functional alcoholic, died of a heart attack at the age of 44. So at the tender age of 17, I got to teach my mother how to write checks and how to manage a household. Drusy survived 3 cancers and died in 2008 at the age of 85. And they are buried at the family lot in Grove Cemetery. And with me, we come full circle in more ways than one. I'm here in Belfast. You remember Axel Hayford? Well, in 1864, Axel's daughter married Marcellus Cooper, a local lumber dealer. And in 1871, Axel deeded an in-town lot on Cedar Street to his daughter, not to his daughter and her husband, to his daughter. You remember where all the Murches were in 1885? That's Olive Hayford Cooper Marcellus' house, where she was living in 1885. And this would be nothing more than a minor historical footnote, but for those of you who know what's coming, that is the house that Meredith and I bought in 1999. And had no idea. No idea. That's the house when we bought it. That's the house today.
Is that the same tree?
That is the same tree. Yeah, it's a white spruce. Yeah. There's the house with the winter candles in the windows and the front entrance. We thought the house ought to be named after Olive Hayford Cooper, so we did. Comments, questions? Yes.
Basically, your grandfather never bought a car.
Correct.
Normal?
Yeah, especially if you lived in a town where you could walk to everything. You could walk to work. You could only if someone else took him. Right. He went out to Swan. I know they went to Swan Lake to a camp, so they must have had some local person who had a car.
Did your dad have the bays in his ancestry? Usual middle name.
Dubé, D-U-B-E, an anglicized to Dubé. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah. So I have one quick postscript, and then we can eat. You remember Charlotte? Well, one day I was leafing through old issues of Sprague's Journal of Maine History, which some of you history buffs may know. It ran for 20-odd years. And I love looking at the advertisements, especially. And in it I found Charlotte's poem, Wawenoc Lake. And it said it was from a book of poems called The Desire of the Moth for the Flame. Well, says I ought to find a copy of that. Huh. There is one known copy in existence. And it is at, of all places, the special collections library at Colby College. And that's what it looks like. Leather bound with a leather binding. I was able to sweet talk the reference librarian into unwrapping it, photographing it. And then I said, well, you know what? I need a short-term achievable goal. You guessed it. I've written and published a book which summarizes Charlotte's ancestry, tells you everything I could discover about Charlotte's life and death, that of her 2 husbands and her 2 kids, and that reproduces her book of poetry. And I have them for sale for $15, and I have a present to the library. Let's eat. Yeah.
Dana, did her abusing husband ever get prosecuted?
You have to read the book.